I'm Bob again, here to present a video that's mostly a study of how our beautiful and amazing Minneapolis park system was founded. This material is taken from a larger project I was working on a few years ago and plan to come back to. I'm currently advocating for what I call a transit revolution and drawing on the history of the Minneapolis park system's founding in the 1880s as the mother of all historical examples for how the public-private coordination or public-private mix needed to accomplish this has been achieved before and can be achieved again. The material includes excerpts from a 2006 interview with then Minnesota House Speaker Steve Swigum, going point by point through my 8-point Minnesota Republican state legislators' contract with voters, something I'm also continuing to advocate.
But when we do get to the House floor and in committee, every person, every member, minority, majority, War Road, Minneapolis, every person in the committee and on the floor gets the same vote, the same opportunity to speak, the same opportunity to address the legislation, to amend legislation. And I'm not sure what's meant by winner take all.
I guess kind of at an angle. This is essentially an interview format. There are 4 cameras, so one of them's going to be on you, one of them's on me, one of them's on both of us, and then that's just an additional angle shot there. As you know, one of the things that I'm doing is trying to promote an effort for the Republican Party to move in a more moderate direction. In recent years, we've had a focus on the governor, and obviously with the '98 very unusual election of Governor Ventura, you could say that we kind of tried the superhero approach to try to solve government's problems by having an individual come in there and get in there and fix everything. But you know, in a Republican form of government, it seems to me that of the 3 branches, the legislature is actually the most important. So one of the things I wanted to talk about before getting into these line items is, what do you think is the relationship between the different branches of government, and how should the legislature function to be most effective in a Republican form of government, and also what's the relationship between the governor and the legislature?
The current governor?
In general, what do you think the relationship should be?
Okay, well, I think that when we look at our 3 branches of government, obviously, if you're a student of history or of the process itself, you know that there has to be a balance. And I will use the word balance many, many times, because I think balance is important in your political philosophy, it's important in governing, and it's certainly a balance between the 3 branches of government is appropriate, as our founding foremothers and forefathers decided between the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. You would be there to balance each other, to make sure that neither branch extends too far over the other one in relationship to power, that there be a balance that be struck, and I think that that's very, very important. I think we try to strike that balance.
We've been listening to some excerpts and the lead-in from an interview with Minnesota House Speaker Steve Swigum. We've also been looking from some different viewing points at the new Guthrie Theater here in the historic Milling District in downtown Minneapolis. Part of the Guthrie is over my right shoulder. On my left shoulder is the ruin of the second Washburn A mill. This was built on the same site as the first Washburn A mill. That was destroyed in an explosion and fire in 1878. This is a history of Minneapolis written by the Reverend Marion Shutter. He describes the explosion and disaster that happened then. There is no casualty in the history of milling which in destruction of property and loss of life equals the explosion of May 2nd, 1878, which blew to dust 3 massive mills, 3 of smaller size, a railroad roundhouse, a sash, door, and blind factory, a machine shop, and blotted out 18 human lives. One account says, "The great roof of the Washburn A mill arose to a height of 500 feet. The air was filled with the debris from the 3 great mills, Washburn A, Humboldt, and Diamond. Timbers, stone, iron, and human bodies commingled, and instantaneously the whole mass was lurid with flame, and the ground for a space of several acres around the demolished buildings was covered with the remains of the three great structures, now blown to atoms by an unseen power which no man could measure or at that time comprehend. The greatest loss of life was in the Washburn Mill, where 14 were instantly killed. 3 men were also killed in the Diamond, Humboldt, and Zenith mills, and the 18th victim was living near the Washburn Mill at the time of the explosion. As the casualty occurred at 10 minutes past 7 in the evening, the loss of life was not as great as it would have been had the explosion taken place during the busy hours of the day. The employees of the sash, door, and blind factory had gone home about half an hour before the explosion, and the millmen of the night shift had just taken the places of the daymen. The fragments of the bodies gathered from the ruins were borne to Lakewood Cemetery and buried together. A beautiful monument was raised over their graves by the head millers of Minneapolis. The meadow in front of the Washburn Mill ruins is part of Mill Ruins Park. As part of the Minneapolis Grand Rounds of Parkways, it runs along the west bank of the Mississippi through the milling district. As far as I know, this is the only Minneapolis park that introduces itself to us with a roadblock sign. Mill Ruins Park is a kind of escape route from history that's been blocked off.
If you're a student of history, you know that politics has always been, governing has always been different ideas, different issues, different philosophies, and a confrontation of that.
This place, the park and the museum, is deliberately designed to stop us and to cause a benign but very real confrontation with our history. It has to be benign because families come here with their children. People who visit the Mill City Museum come to this gift shop. Families may stop for lunch at this cafe. No doubt the conversation goes all over the place. That seems to be how we are. We eat, we drink, we talk about sports. But lately, we've been telling pollsters the country is on the wrong track, a railroad metaphor from the 1800s. We don't live in history, but when we do visit history here, children ask questions and parents have to answer them. Why is this building ruined? What happened? Here with my camera off or pointed another way, I saw people walking by outside the Washburn A Mill with heads lowered and somber expressions. There definitely is a kind of confrontation with history here. Almost all parks everywhere are playgrounds and places to escape the daily grind, a phrase rooted in agriculture and milling. Most Minneapolis parks look more like this one, Father Hennepin Park, across the river from the Washburn A Mill and across the road from the Pillsbury A Mill. When it opened in 1881, this was the biggest flour mill in the world. Its daily capacity of 5,000 barrels wasn't reached initially because there wasn't enough wheat to mill. Just by being here, across the river and in an East Bank neighborhood without ruins, by commencing operation with the Washburn Mill disaster, a searing recent memory, Pillsbury A is marking the fact that at least in limited ways we can learn from our past and do better. The east and west banks of the milling district are connected by the Stone Arch Bridge. This was built in 1885 as part of the first rail connection between St. Paul and the west bank of the milling district. The last train ran on this bridge in 1981. Today it has been converted to a bike and pedestrian bridge. The Stone Arch Bridge is part of what is probably the best and most extensive system of urban bike trails in the country. We're back to the east side of the Stone Arch Bridge again, looking at one of the history kiosks, and this one is a little confrontational in a Minnesota nice kind of way. Here's an excerpt from it. The Dakota called the Mississippi River Hahawakpa, River of the Falls. The falls were first seen by Europeans in 1680, when Louis Hennepin, a Catholic friar in the service of France, viewed them from the bluff. Hennepin was brought to the falls by the Dakota, and he watched while they listened to the voices of unseen spirits in the roaring water and made reverent offerings. The priest then crossed himself and named the falls for a Christian saint, Anthony of Padua. Over the next 150 years, traders, soldiers, missionaries, and artists spread the fame of the cataract's majesty and beauty. For speculators and businessmen, however, it held a different kind of fascination. The voice from the history kiosk is true, at least partially. The speculators and businessmen heard voices too, the sirens of supply and demand. Maybe the history kiosk should include a mirror to show us where the demand voices were coming from. Here's a view upriver from the Stone Arch Bridge. This is the upper hydroelectric facility. The power towers have already given us a clue about how much energy is here. This facility has a peak capacity of 30 megawatts. It took about 2 megawatts to run the entire Pillsbury A mill. We don't see what they saw, we see what they did. In the 1800s, speculators and businessmen came, saw, and paved the highest waterfalls along the Mississippi. Here's some of the knowledge that drove them. The Great Plains has relatively little hydropower potential. The upper pool here is only about 800 feet higher than New Orleans. The port of St. Paul was the head of navigation on the Mississippi. This combination of navigation access and hydropower scarcity added up to something that was unique in size and scope. A river bottleneck funneling logs and grain here, power to mill flour and wood here, and all navigable points downriver on the Mississippi to sell the products manufactured here. Like a magnetic energy field, this combination drew in the rail lines spreading across the Great Plains and west of the Pacific.
St. Anthony Falls was covered with what was called an apron after a disaster in 1869 when a tunnel being dug under the river became flooded. The riverbed was limestone, but it was resting on sandstone. Geologists believed that the falls were once in St. Paul and slowly moved upriver to Minneapolis as the sandstone under the riverbed crumbled away over thousands of years. To be blunt, water power was the #1 priority in Minneapolis at the time of the tunnel collapse. An apron over the falls was seen correctly as the only way to ensure continued reliable water power in the milling district. You could say that the falls at St. Anthony were sacrificed on the altar of prosperity. We need to acknowledge that, but we'll also look now at some of the many ways in which Minneapolis, led by businessmen and speculators, tried to balance prosperity with the kind of natural beauty once found at the falls at St. Anthony. In this segment, we'll look back and forth from history to video of the Minneapolis park system today. Reverend Shutter is my main reference source for this segment. We'll see how the founding of the Minneapolis Park Board in 1883 was driven by economic interests, but also by a desire to preserve the natural beauty of Minneapolis for generations to come. What was accomplished in the 1880s and beyond is a remarkable illustration of how private and public interests were coordinated in a very public and open process to advance both private economic goals and public goals, building a park system that would serve all people in Minneapolis and preserving the most beautiful and healthful parts of our environment for generations to come. The 1880s was at the center of an economic boom in milling that ran well into the next century. These graphic benchmarks show how fast Minneapolis was growing as a milling and business hub. The population more than tripled to 165,000 by 1890. The city area was increased from 12 to 52 miles. Over 13 years, manufacturing increased to almost 1,000% of what it was in 1878. Wholesale trade was up more than fourfold. Milled lumber more than doubled. From 200,000 barrels in 1870, flour milling increased almost 30 times in 20 years to over 6 million barrels by 1890. Building on a manufacturing core, Minneapolis grew as a financial center, with 1890 bank clearings 1,500% of what they were in 1880. Local geography also shaped Minneapolis. The city is basically flat. There were, and still are today, many areas of great natural beauty. Foremost among these is a chain of 4 lakes extending from Lake of the Isles, about 2 miles from the milling district, south to Lake Harriet, over 4 miles out. Each of these lakes is about 3 miles around, perfect for a 1-hour evening walk. From Lake Harriet, Minnehaha Creek runs east for about 5 miles to Minnehaha Falls and then into the Mississippi. As we see from this graphic, technology was another growth driver. Patent flour, a new milling process introduced in the 1870s, made wheat grown in northern climates far more valuable, yielding what most people thought was the best flour in the world. Electric power, specifically electric streetcars, would make commuting to work over 5 miles or more practical in Minneapolis. Railroad and telegraph technology went hand in hand as rail lines expanded west, reaching the Pacific in 1893 and supporting both the physical movement of goods and the movement of information needed for finance and markets. These 4 businessmen and speculators played important roles in founding the Park Board. George A. Pillsbury, a successful businessman in Maine, moved to Minneapolis in his 60s to work with his son Charles in the milling business. In 1881, George Pillsbury became the first president of the Minnesota Brush Electric Company, which would be part of the infrastructure for the coming streetcar system. He was elected mayor of Minneapolis in 1884 at age 68. Colonel William King, a speculator, was postmaster of the U.S. House of Representatives for 10 years and served 1 term in Congress. He was a land speculator with a large farm on the east side of Lake Harriet. In 1882, Colonel King was also short of cash. The farm was transferred, the whole mess ended up in court, and King won a $2 million judgment in the mid-1880s. We'll come back to that dollar amount. Charles Loring, businessman, flour miller, founder or co-founder of many businesses and organizations, and all-around do-gooder, was far and away the leader in founding and developing the Minneapolis park system. He was the Park Board's president from the get-go in 1883 to 1890. Loring was also president of the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce for much of this time, 1886 to 1890. Thomas Lowry, businessman, controlled the horse-powered Minneapolis Street Railroad Company. When this system started the conversion to electric in 1889, it had 189 cars, 415 horses, and 69 miles of track. 4 years later, Minneapolis had a transformed streetcar system with new electric cars and new track. These businessmen and speculators, and others, led the campaign for the Park Board and built the foundation of our park system in the 1880s. Let's consider what they foresaw in the year 1883 and what their values were. It was obvious that Minneapolis would be driven by an economic boom that would be measured in decades. Minneapolitans had already thought this way for a long time. When the original downtown streets were platted, they were sized to the scale of Chicago. These people saw a relationship. The combination of an economic boom and streetcar commuters would drive land values up fast. They also understood that land appreciation could be both directed and supercharged by building a foundation for parks that would make it obvious that land and home values near those parks would increase rapidly for decades. In short, private economic interests would benefit from quickly establishing a park system on a scale far beyond what most cities the size of Minneapolis could contemplate. What did these businessmen and speculators value? Economic prosperity and profitable businesses, certainly, but they also put a high value on building for the future and thinking ahead 100 years. They wanted to be good stewards of the earth, an idea rooted in their Judeo-Christian worldview. These businessmen and speculators acted on a belief that public works and private interests could and should be coordinated in a way to reconcile and promote all of their values. Things moved quickly in 1883. Here's the timeline with some detail. We've already met some of the main promoters. In January of 1883, the Board of Trade was revived. Purpose: conducting a campaign for city parks. President: George Pillsbury. Secretary: Colonel William King. In January, resolutions were adopted calling upon the legislature to pass an act creating a park commission for founding of such a grand system of public parks and boulevards as the natural situation offers. Colonel King remarked, "No subject can be brought up which has such an effect upon the interests of the city. It is a scheme which will bring more capital, more population,
and add more to the city's renown than any other scheme which could be devised. 2 years ago, we could have bought 700 acres around the lakes for $50,000, and today the property is worth $300,000, but no one would move in the matter, and the opportunity was lost. For what is now a mere bagatelle, we can lay out a system of parks which will be a pride of the city for all time to come, but there must be work done. It can be done in 40 days, and a system be devised which will add millions to the taxable real estate of the city. Colonel King's 40 days was no doubt intended to have a biblical ring to it. His prophecy was off by less than a month. The delay was due to the legislature's response to opponents of the Park Act. The City Council objected to the Park Act, saying the Park Board was being given arbitrary power without voter approval. The legislature responded, requiring Minneapolis to have a referendum. The Knights of Labor objected to the Park Act. Only the rich were represented. Although the people are kindly permitted to vote at the ensuing election for or against a park system, they are not allowed to say who shall serve as commissioners until 1 year hence, and the door is left open to rob the working classes of their homes and make driveways for the rich at the expense of the poor. Here's what the Evening Journal published February 13, 1883, as the battle was joined. There exists in all cities a class of obstructionists and reactionary old fogies who set their faces like flint against any innovation or improvements. Their first move will no doubt be to excite jealousy by claiming that somebody is going to make something out of the park scheme. They will assert that it is nothing more or less than a gigantic real estate speculation on the part of a clique who are seeking to use the credit of the city of Minneapolis to promote their scheme. Supplementary to this will be the cry of taxes, taxes. As we saw, the Knights of Labor objected to the fact that they couldn't vote for park commissioners for a year. Here's something to think about. An excerpt from Ariel Trahan's 2007 honors thesis at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. From 1884 until today, Minneapolis has been, and is, the only city in the country where we elect our park board. The referendum was held April 3rd. The Park Act passed with 5 of 8 wards in favor, 3 against. The total votes and percentages were 5,327 votes and 58% yes, 3,922 votes and 42% no. We'll come back to the 3 wards that voted no. The new park board immediately hired the best consultant they could find, Professor H.W.S. Cleveland of Chicago, a landscape architect of long experience and high reputation. 12 years earlier, Professor Cleveland had lost all his material possessions in the Great Chicago Fire. Professor Cleveland had worked 1 year for Frederick Olmsted, New York's park commissioner, designer of New York's Central Park, and America's foremost landscape architect. Cleveland shared Olmsted's values, including his commitment to parks that were open to all. Here's what Wikipedia says. The design of Central Park embodies Olmsted's social consciousness and commitment to egalitarian ideals. Influenced by Downing and by his own observations regarding social class in England, China, and the American South, Olmsted believed that the common green space must always be equally accessible to all citizens. This principle is now so fundamental to the idea of a public park as to seem self-evident, but it was not so then. Olmsted's tenure as park commissioner can be described as one long struggle to preserve that idea. Professor Cleveland's plan was read aloud to the park board in June of 1883. For years, this plan formed the basis for building a park system, with the emphasis on system. In Professor Cleveland's plan, the Mississippi River would be the backbone of a system of parks and connecting boulevards. These boulevards would provide both beauty and fire control. Lake Street, stretching from the Mississippi to Lake Calhoun, was to be 200 feet wide. Cleveland identified a hill about 2.5 miles northwest of the Milling District as offering the finest view I have yet seen of the central portions of the city. This hill became part of the 20-acre 3rd Ward Park, established by the Park Board in its first year of operation. Cleveland's plan included more than 20 miles of parkways, completely encircling the central portions of the city, with a total area of less than 1,000 acres exclusive of boulevards. Here's an excerpt from Professor Cleveland's report that goes right to the heart. Pardon me for thus dwelling upon a subject with the details of which you must be more familiar than I can be. My only object is to impress this point strongly upon you when considering the arrangement of a system of parks and public improvements. If you have faith in the future greatness of your city, do not shrink from securing while you may such areas as will be adequate to the wants of such a city. Do not be appalled at the thought of appropriating lands which seem now too costly, simply because they are far out of proportion to your present wants. That was precisely the feeling which prevented the purchase of Nicollet Island when it might have been had for a sum which now seems contemptible. Look forward for a century to the time when the city has a population of 1 million, and think what will be their wants. They will have wealth enough to purchase all that money can buy, but all their wealth cannot purchase a lost opportunity or restore natural features of grandeur and beauty, which would then possess priceless value, and which you can preserve for them if you will but say the word and save them from the destruction which certainly awaits them if you fail to utter it. This attitude, more than any specific feature of any plan, is what brought to Minneapolis the blessing of our park system. In addition to the Third Ward Park, land for several other parks was secured by the Park Board in 1883. The largest of these was Central Park, now Loring Park, a 30-acre park a mile from the milling district. Here's what Ariel Trahan wrote about Loring Park in his honors thesis. When Loring Park first opened, it embodied the pleasure ground idea that landscape architects had been advocating in all major cities. Horace Cleveland designed the park based on the ideals of the park as an antidote to city life. As a result, he attempted to create a space in which a person would forget the fact that they were in a city. The park consisted of many broad, meandering walkways, elaborate flower gardens, highly decorative trees, and large open meadows. Views from the park were controlled by various types of vegetation, so that a park patron could never see the city that surrounded them. Landscape architects and civic leaders collaborated to form urban parks in order to construct a more well-rounded urban landscape. In addition to the Third Ward Park, the Park Board added 2 other ward parks in 1883. The First Ward Park, now Logan Park, was about 10 acres and is located a little more than a mile north of the east bank of the milling district. The 20-acre Sixth Ward Park, now Riverside Park, stretches along the west bank of the Mississippi, north of today's I-94. Let's go back to that ward-by-ward referendum graphic and see where the new ward parks were located. Each ward park was in one of the 3 wards that voted no in the referendum. Our Republican form of government was working. Referendums were held, squeaky wheels were greased. Clearly, the Park Board was seeking to win over these wards and to build a consensus throughout the city that would support the emerging park system. It worked. The Knights of Labor, wary opponents of the new system in 1883, had a picnic at Lake Harriet in 1887 and became supporters of the park system. But driveways for the rich weren't being neglected. The driving force behind that was along the line of Colonel King's January 1883 speech. Parks and boulevards around the lakes would increase property values near the lakes. Lake of the Isles was the nearest of the chain of lakes to the milling district, but not emphasized in Professor Cleveland's 1883 plan. This didn't stop property owners around Isles from organizing and taking things into their own hands. Here's what the Park Board said about Lake of the Isles improvements in its report for the year ending March 4, 1886. The greater part of the lands have been contributed by the owners, and should the same disposition be manifested by the remainder, the Board will feel justified in undertaking its improvements, which will, from its proximity to the city and the beauty of its scenery, constitute a very attractive portion of the park system and cannot fail to add largely to the value of adjacent lands. In 1889, the Park Board's development engine went into high gear.
Professor Cleveland's plan included Minnehaha Falls as a park, but his plan didn't include Minnehaha Creek in the parkway system. When property owners demanded high prices and the legislature balked at establishing a state park at Minnehaha Falls, the Minneapolis Park Board offered to pay for 123 acres of land and take title to it. The cost was $92,000. Early in 1889, land on both sides of Minnehaha Creek, running most of the way from Lake Harriet to Lyndale Avenue, was donated to the Park Board on condition of building a road on either side. Generous offers were also received for almost 3 miles of parkway on both sides of Minnehaha Creek, from Lyndale to Cedar Avenue. By the end of 1889, the Park Board had 1,088 acres, excluding the lake areas of Harriet and Calhoun, up from about 250 land acres the previous year. 510 of these acres had been donated. The remainder had been bought with $663,000 in 20-year bonds, and the bonds were being retired with assessments. Colonel King's land holdings were large and well situated. The Park Commissioner's house, built around 1906 for Theodore Worth, sits on part of what was King's farm. But the fact that one person's private holdings alone represented about 3 times the total paid by the Park Board for all park bonds as of 1889 shows how powerfully the private economic interest of landholders was driving the expansion of the park system. After only 7 years of operation, it was now certain that a 16-mile loop of continuous parks and parkways would be completed, from the Milling District, around the western lakes, along Minnehaha Creek to the falls, and along the Mississippi back to the Milling District. We'll look at some views of Loring Park today as we listen to an extended excerpt from Reverend Shutter's book describing Charles Loring and his contribution to the Minneapolis park system in the 1880s. In 1861, while still a young man, he came to the city after a sojourn of a few years in Chicago and became a merchant and a miller of high repute and large fortune. The other side of his character was portrayed by one of his most stalwart friends and admirers, Judge Isaac Atwater, in these words: Mr. Loring's identification with the park system of Minneapolis constitutes his most conspicuous, as it will be the most enduring memento of his public service. His love of nature, his taste for rural embellishment, expressed in tree planting and in surrounding several residences which he had erected with arboreal beauty, were well recognized characteristics, so that when the first Board of Park Commissioners was selected, his name headed the list. Upon the organization of the board in 1883, although at the time absent in Europe, he was selected by his colleagues as president of the commission and held the position by annual elections until his retirement in 1890. The position was without compensation, but he gave to it his thought and unstinted time. His labor was born of enthusiasm and love of rural art. In the selection of locations for the first parks, his views were far more comprehensive than those of a majority of his colleagues, who have already realized in lost opportunities their own lack of appreciation. Most of the projects which have given the city such a magnificent system of interconnected parks and boulevards were marked out by him. In full sympathy with the accomplished landscape architect, Professor H.W.S. Cleveland, and with the official park superintendent, William M. Berry, and cordially seconded in his efforts by his colleagues of the Park Board, Mr. Loring had the satisfaction of seeing, during his connection with the board, the system so far perfected as to ensure it from failure and commanding the most complete approval of the people. Before his retirement from the board, in spite of his remonstrance, his name was given to the central gem of the system, and Loring Park will, through the years to come, perpetuate the name and honorable service of the first president of the Park Commission. I want to conclude this history by emphasizing 3 main points. First, history can never be a science because it is always a unique combination of events and factors. The businessmen and speculators who built the foundations of the Minneapolis park system in the 1880s understood clearly the size and scope of economic growth Minneapolis could expect, but the underlying circumstances, local and national geology and geography, were unique. For this reason, it's very speculative to compare what happened in Minneapolis with what happened elsewhere in the U.S. Second, what did result from establishing a park system of the scope and quality we have in Minneapolis has resulted in a kind of Minneapolis way of thinking. It's a natural tendency to assume that public and private interests are inextricably woven together and are interdependent. It's a reflex, trying to coordinate public and private actions, trying to find the right public-private mix that will move us toward win-win outcomes. Both Minneapolis and Minnesota have been unusually good over the years in coordinating public and private sector activity to achieve what we have called a good quality of life. It seems to me that the root of this skill, and it is a skill, can be traced back to how amazingly well this coordination worked as the Minneapolis park system was established and expanded. Third, parks and park systems are infrastructure. Minneapolis has already gone a long way in promoting bikes as a way of commuting, using the park infrastructure we already have. I've heard that Minneapolis congressional earmarks for bike trails and bridges have been ridiculed as the kind of waste Alaska's Bridge to Nowhere represents. The reality is completely different. In Minneapolis, we're moving toward a transportation system that combines buses and light rail with bikes, segways, scooters, electric wheelchairs, skates, and walking. People can cover the first and last mile any way that's convenient, and all the miles in between with buses, light rail, and who knows, maybe expanded carpools. Later in this series, we'll look at something I call the Skyby, a way to build on our Minneapolis park infrastructure with dedicated, all-season bicycle skyways that can greatly reduce our use of cars in urban cores. Like Minneapolis businessmen and speculators of the 1880s, we need to see the opportunities that today's innovations in transportation technology offer. We need to figure out how to coordinate public and private interests to build new kinds of infrastructures that will bring new blessings to future generations. As just one possible example, in the coming decades, Skyby systems could be a way for many U.S. cities to build a combined transportation and parks infrastructure, moving toward the kind of parks infrastructure we have been blessed with here in Minneapolis. My initial 10-page plan for the Skyby is online at republicancontract.com. Naturally, we'll look at how public-private partnerships can be coordinated to achieve this. After this incredible 30-minute wind-up, Speaker Swigum, who had gone back to the dugout to check his email and return some phone calls, made it back into the batter's box just in time for the pitch on point 7 of the contract. And here it comes. Number 7 here. Minnesota has a history of maintaining a good public-private mix, a strong private sector combined with an excellent public sector, including government and nonprofits. This mix is the foundation of what is often called the quality of life. The Minneapolis park system is an excellent example. We need to keep asking what is best done in the public sector, what's best done in the private sector, and where do public-private combinations make sense. And on the park system in particular, that was actually very controversial when that came in, but Minneapolis, and this was done primarily by Republicans at the time, decided that we have this unique opportunity with these lakes to have a outstanding park system. And so a decision was made to try to acquire all the land around those lakes. And it was very controversial. There was a referendum held on it. But the result of it is that in Minneapolis, you have Lake Harriet, Lake Calhoun, Lake of the Isles, and almost all of Cedar Lake. And all of the property around those lakes is in the public domain. And as a result, it seems to me that actually has a major economic impact on the development of the Twin Cities. The ability to have this quality of life where you have all that in the public domain is really something kind of unusual. Of course, now there's a big effort to buy more parkland throughout Hennepin County, and that's going to be a lot more expensive than it was back in the 1890s. But in terms of Minnesota's competitive advantage, do you think that the public-private mix of having maybe more relative to other states going into things like the park system and education, do you think that's been a competitive advantage for Minnesota historically? And is that one of our strengths?
I would say that balance is part of our strength. And in Minnesota, our quality of life is many things. Parks, yes, but that's a small part of it. There's many, many other things that are part of Minnesota's quality of life. you know, that first of all, as you know, it works in Minnesota. We're the healthiest state in the nation. Our students have the best test scores in the nation. We have the least number of uninsured in the nation. Our unemployment rate is amongst the lowest in the nation. So it works in Minnesota, the balance. And part of the quality of life, it's different things to different people, but I think it's all those things together. To some people, the quality of life means our park system and our wonderful natural resources, our 14,000 lakes, and the ability, the quality to be able to go out and fish or boat if they want to. I think that's wonderful. Part of our quality of life is a clean environment. You know, that's wonderful. Sometimes it takes 20 below zero for a few days to, you know, to get rid of some of the bugs that are in the soils and the airs that they have down south. But that's part of the quality of life. Part of the quality of life is having a Guthrie Theater. Part of the quality of life is, you know, having a decent public transportation and private transportation system. Roads and bridges with a mix of transit, a balance of transit. Part of the quality of life is, just this last session, maybe keeping baseball in Minnesota. You know, if the stadium bill doesn't pass this last session, the Twins leave. To some, that destroys the quality of life that is Minnesota. So quality of life is hard to define specifically because it's different things to different people. Some of it is just the graciousness of having, you know, the good Minnesota nice feeling, you know, that we're actually nice to each other here and we pay attention, we care about each other. So, you know, it's a whole bunch, Bob, of things that make that quality of life as we balance it together. And I don't think you can say it's any one thing. I think it's many things.
We were running out of time at this point, and we moved on to a discussion of an alternative to the marriage amendment presented later with sound. How should we score this one? Maybe something like foul strike 2. What it boils down to is this. Speaker Swigum didn't see the windup we just saw. He took a swing at this, but the pitch he got from the stretch wasn't a very good one. He appears to agree, citing examples such as the Guthrie and the new Twins Stadium that do represent public-private partnerships. For now, let's just leave it at this. When you look closely at the history of the park system, we really do see a unique process here in Minnesota in coordinating public and private interests. We'll learn more about how Minneapolis and Minnesota have been shaped both in history and by history as we keep returning to this place where Minneapolis is deliberately making history as visible as possible. But we'll also be returning to think and learn about the many ways we've tried to escape from history and why we have such good reasons for trying. History is in many ways a disaster. You'd have to be crazy not to want to escape from it. Unfortunately, when escape takes the form of ignorance, there's a price to be paid. We seem to have to keep reenacting it. Anyone can draw a line in a river, but it takes a village or a city to make it stay. That's what we did here. The benefit was power, mechanical power for milling, then electric power that ran an early Minneapolis streetcar system. From pilgrims to cell phones, the history of America can be seen as one big escape attempt. Early colonists came to escape a history of religious persecution. Our Republican form of government is, not was, is, an attempt to escape a history of rule by remote, arbitrary, unaccountable government. At its root, our Civil War was an attempt to escape our history of slavery. Here in the Milling District, we can almost see this line in the river as a line between history and escape. In Minneapolis, our park system has always been a part of the rhythm of daily life, a way to escape the daily grind and history, at least for a while. In recent times, it has been easy for most people in Minneapolis to cross back and forth over this line between history and escape. But today and throughout our history, others have found this line difficult or impossible to cross. For some, barriers have been economic or cultural. The lives of many others have been cut short by war and by industrial or transportation accidents. Many Minnesotans have permanent physical injuries from wars our nation has fought and from accidents. It seems inevitable, at least in the short run, that America and Minnesota will continue to be decisively in the world and in history. But there are many ways that we can make this line between history and escape easier for all people to cross on a daily basis, both locally and around the world.